She wasn't evicted because she was late on rent. She was evicted because a coward landlord thought a single mother with two babies and no one in her corner was easy prey. He was right. And for 5 years, every person around her neighbors, co-workers, strangers in the hallway watched it happen and did absolutely nothing, including me. I stood behind my curtains and told myself it wasn't my fight. I told myself staying quiet kept me safe. But silence isn't neutral. Silence is a choice. And the night he locked her out in a freezing storm with two small children pressed against her chest, I finally understood what my silence had actually cost her and what it had cost me. What I didn't know was that somewhere across the city, the most dangerous man in Orlando already knew her name, and he was already coming, not to rescue her, to reclaim what was always his. This channel is built for people who understand that some are simply born to rule. There are lessons that no classroom will ever teach you, lessons that only the most powerful, most ruthless, and most misunderstood men in the world carry. This isn't a channel about crime. This is a channel about mindset, about spine, about the brutal truth of what real power actually looks like behind closed doors. Welcome. Now let's begin. Here is what this story is really about. The most dangerous thing you will ever do is nothing. Every time you stay silent when something is wrong, you don't protect yourself. You become part of the machine that destroys people. The neighbor who finally made one phone call, the housekeeper who slipped one folded note under a door. Those small, terrified acts of courage changed everything. Power isn't always loud. Sometimes courage is just refusing to look away one more time. That is the lesson this story carries, and it will stay with you long after the last word. If this story hit differently for you, drop a comment below and tell me the moment that stopped you cold. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, because some stories deserve more than one set of ears. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications because the next story is already waiting, and trust me, you don't want to miss where this world goes next.
The air in my apartment always smelled of my neighbor's cheap laundry soap and whatever greasy meal our landlord was cooking. It was a world away from expensive cedar and gun oil. I sat in my worn-out armchair, listening to the rhythmic creak of the floorboards as Chloe paced her kitchen, trying to soothe a crying child. Through the paper-thin walls, I lived the periphery of her life. I knew she worked at the diner down the street, that she was 34, and that she was completely, utterly alone. Her face, even when exhausted, was a map of soft curves and fierce determination. From my window, I'd see our landlord, Paul Abernathy, watching her, his eyes leaving a slimy trail of contempt that made my stomach turn. I did nothing. I always told myself to mind my own business. I'd hear her come in late, her keys fumbling with the lock at 2 in the morning, the cold Orlando air clinging to her coat. "Just a little longer, babies," I'd hear her whisper through the door. I saw the cheap groceries, the secondhand toys, the constant exhaustion etched on her face. The streets outside our building were always desolate after dark, casting long, sickly shadows that seemed to swallow people whole. I wanted to knock, to offer her a hot cup of tea, to tell her she wasn't alone. But fear of Abernathy, of losing my own fragile peace, kept me locked inside my own four walls, a spectator to her struggle. Tonight, I watched it all from behind my faded curtains. Paul Abernathy stood on the landing, his heavy frame blocking her way. She was on the steps below, bundled in that old maroon wool coat that looked like it belonged to another lifetime. She was a fortress, her soft, full body curved around her two children, trying to shield them from the biting wind as much as from Abernathy's vile words. He was sneering, dangling the new keys in her face. Even from my window, I could see the panic in her eyes, the desperate plea she was trying to hold back. And I could see the fierce, protective way she held her children, absorbing the cruelty so it wouldn't touch them. I knew that coat. I'd seen her patch a tear in the sleeve just last week, her fingers careful and precise. It was the one beautiful thing she owned. "You have until tomorrow, Paul, I swear," I heard her plead, her voice shaking but strong. He just laughed, a horrible guttural sound that echoed in the stairwell. My hand went to my phone. I should call someone, report him. But I was a coward. I was afraid of his retaliation, of him turning on me next. So I just stood there, hidden and ashamed, as he slammed the door to her apartment, the click of the new deadbolt as loud as a gunshot in the silent hall. A look of pure, hollowed-out defeat washed over her face. The fight just drained out of her, and for a moment, she looked terrifyingly small. My heart seized in my chest. She pulled her children closer, kissed their heads, and then she stood up. Every step she took down the slush-covered walkway felt like a judgment against me. My mind was screaming. I was letting this happen. I was watching a mother and her two babies walk out into a freezing night with nowhere to go. The guilt was a physical weight pressing down on my lungs. I had let that monster win, and my silence was my consent. The image of her face, raw and red from the wind, her eyes dark with a terror I couldn't comprehend, burned itself into my mind. I couldn't sit here anymore. She was a good person, a good mother. I'd see her sharing her meager dinner with the stray cat that lived in the alley. She deserved so much better than a neighbor who was too afraid to speak up, too selfish to help. Her beautiful, soft roundness was a testament to her strength, not a weakness to be mocked. And as I watched her disappear into the sleet, I realized my silence hadn't protected me. It had just made me complicit. I kept seeing their faces, Arthur and Lily, two little kids with hair like spun gold, and those shocking Romano blue eyes. They were so small, so innocent. They deserved a warm bed and a hot meal, not a frozen park bench. They trusted their mother to protect them, and she was doing everything in her power to do just that. But she was just one person against the world. My inaction felt like I had personally helped Paul Abernathy push them out into the cold. The shame was a bitter pill I could no longer swallow. I had to do something, anything. I knew she didn't have anyone else to call. I'd overheard her on the phone with a social worker, her voice tight with strained politeness, as she begged for a housing voucher. Abernathy knew exactly what he was doing, locking her out in the middle of a Tuesday night when every office, every shelter, was likely full or closed. It was a calculated act of cruelty by a pathetic man who got his power from preying on the vulnerable. And for 5 years, I had stood by and watched him do it to others, always telling myself it wasn't my fight. I never knew the whole story of the life she'd run from. I just saw the results. I saw the way she would flinch at loud noises, the haunted look in her eyes when a black car drove by too slowly. She had built a fragile wall around herself and her children with tips from a greasy spoon diner and sheer force of will. She had survived for 5 years on her own, hiding and scraping by to give those children a life free from whatever threats whispered in her past. Tonight, Paul Abernathy had taken a sledgehammer to that wall. I'd heard his disgusting comments about her through the thin apartment walls, mocking her weight, calling her lazy. He was a small, slimy man who couldn't stand to see a woman, a single mother, who refused to be broken by him. He saw her soft, heavy body as a sign of failure. But I saw her as a shield, a warm, living shelter that had kept her babies safe. Her body wasn't a liability. It was the only home her children could truly count on. Abernathy didn't evict her because of her weight. He used it as an excuse to punish her for her strength. Then, a thought sparked through my panic. It was a small thing, maybe a useless thing, but I had to try. My hands were shaking as I unlocked my apartment door and crept into the hallway. The air was frigid. Abernathy's illegal, handwritten eviction notice was still taped to her door. My heart hammered against my ribs, terrified he would hear me. I pulled out my phone, its screen a damningly bright light in the dim hall. I took a clear photo of the notice. Then, I took another of the shiny, new deadbolt he'd just installed. I had proof. I scurried back into my apartment, my breath coming in ragged plumes. It wasn't much. It wouldn't make them warm tonight. But it was a start. It was me, finally, refusing to be a silent bystander. I sat at my kitchen table, the photos glowing on my phone, and I started searching for the number for the Orlando Tenants' Rights Union. I wouldn't let him get away with this. I wouldn't let him terrorize another family while I hid behind my curtains. This was me breaking my own silence. Finally, I found an email address for an emergency advocate. My fingers, still trembling, typed out the whole story. The illegal lockout, the constant harassment, the lack of notice. I explained there were two small children out in the freezing cold. I attached the pictures of the notice and the lock. When I hit send, a sob of terror and relief escaped me. I had finally done something. I had no idea that a ghost from her past was kneeling before her on a park bench, or that her life was about to change forever. I just knew I could no longer live with the sound of my own silence. I remember the first time I saw her, dragging two toddlers and a broken laundry basket up the stairs. She had a kind of worn-down brightness then. But watching from my window now, that light was long gone. I saw the sleek black car slice through the freezing rain and stop. I saw him get out, a man carved from winter shadows and fury. When he reached for her, and she flinched back, I felt my own breath catch in my throat. He wasn't like the landlord, all bluster and cheap threats. This was real danger. Then he touched the little boy's cheek, so gently, and I saw a universe of pain and regret in that one small gesture. I'd watched her struggle for years, and did nothing. I couldn't hear his words, but I saw the impact they had on Chloe. It was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. The fight, the tension that held her upright for so long, just dissolved, leaving her swaying in the wind. A ghost of relief crossed her face, immediately swallowed by a tidal wave of something awful. I knew that look. It was the face of someone realizing they'd been running from the wrong monster all along. I thought of every time I'd heard her landlord screaming, every notice taped to her door, and how I'd just turned away, pretending not to see. I was a ghost too, haunting the edges of her tragedy. He rose to his full height then, a giant blotting out the gray sky. He didn't shout, not at first. He just gave an order, and when she didn't move, he reached for her. I flinched, expecting brutality, but the way he pulled her up was firm, almost careful. He was angry, yes, but not out of control. He was taking control. The sudden motion made her stumble right into him, and for a half-second the world stopped. From my vantage point, it looked less like a threat and more like two magnets snapping together after being kept apart for far too long. He held her there, and the air in the alley felt thick with things I couldn't understand. It was just a moment, that stillness between them, but it felt like an eternity. Then he pushed her back, a raw, ragged edge to his movements. He barked an order, and before she could react, he scooped the little boy into his arms. I watched, my heart in my mouth, as he wrapped his own expensive wool coat around the shivering child. It was the most tender, fiercely protective thing I had ever seen. The little boy, Arthur, started to cry for his mom, and the sound cut right through me. My own kids were inside, warm and fed, and I was just standing here, a coward, watching her world get torn apart and maybe, just maybe, put back together. The big man, Victor, I think she cried his name, marched them towards that tank of a car. Another man, Declan, jumped out, looking ready for a fight, but his face went slack when he saw the child in his boss's arms. Orders were snapped, the back door of the SUV swung open, and a wave of warm air billowed out into the miserable street. It was like a portal to another world. He put the boy inside, then all but pushed Chloe and the little girl in after him. She just collapsed onto the seat, a broken doll finally being put away. I saw her pull her son back into her arms, a reflex of a mother who knew nothing else. The doors slammed shut, sealing them inside. The silence that fell over the alley was deafening, heavier than the snow that was starting to fall. They were gone, swallowed up by a world of plush leather and silent, powerful engines. I was left staring at the empty space where they had stood, the dirty snow already covering their footprints. A profound sense of shame washed over me. I had watched this woman freeze and starve, and my biggest contribution was to occasionally leave a can of soup by her door, like a coward leaving an offering for a ghost. He was taking them to an estate, a secure compound. He was saving them, in his own terrifying way. I finally moved from the window, my own apartment feeling like a cage of my own making. On her door, the illegal eviction notice was still taped there, a monument to my inaction. I knew he was right to make her take off that wet coat. I'd seen her huddled in it for days, the damp chill clinging to her and the kids. She was protecting them with the last of her strength, even when her own protection was making them colder. My gaze fell on the phone on my counter. It felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. What kind of person am I, who watches a family be destroyed by poverty and does nothing? I bet he didn't even see the cheap clothes or the extra weight she carried. I'd seen the way other men in the building looked at her, with pity or contempt. But from the way that man looked at her in the alley, with that possessive fire, he saw something else entirely. He saw his. He saw the mother of his children, who looked so much like him, it was startling. I pictured them inside that warm car, the truth finally coming out. The kids getting names, a history, Arthur and Lily. Good, strong names. He was a monster, maybe, but he was their monster. And right now, that felt a hell of a lot better than the indifferent cruelty of the world she'd been living in. I imagine her tear falling, and him, a man of such violence, wiping it away so gently. I shuddered thinking of the landlord, Mr. Henderson, who had screamed at her that she and her brats would die on the street. That was a real threat. That was a slow, freezing death sentence he had handed down. And I had been a silent witness to the verdict. The rage that had been simmering in me for months finally boiled over. Fear had kept me quiet. Fear of Henderson, fear of getting involved. But what I saw today, it changed something. "You robbed me of 5 years," I imagined him saying. Well, Mr. Henderson robbed those kids of a home. They were probably at his estate by now, a fortress of wealth and power somewhere far from this crumbling neighborhood. A gilded cage, maybe, but it was warm. It was safe. The gates would close, shutting out the cold, shutting out men like Henderson. But here, in the real world, men like him got away with it every single day. They held the power of eviction, of life and death, over people like Chloe, over people like me. I looked at the eviction notice again. My heart was pounding. I knew what I had to do. I wasn't brave like her, but maybe I could find a different kind of courage. I can just picture it. A staff of people rushing out to meet them, a whole army to care for 2 cold children, a doctor on the way. She'd be surrounded by a terrifying sort of safety now. The last threads of her broken freedom were gone, but so was the constant grinding fear of homelessness and starvation. She traded one prison for another, but at least this one had doctors and hot food. For 5 years, she was invisible. Now, she was the center of a very dangerous man's world. And back here, in the shadows she just escaped, I was about to make a choice. To stay invisible or to finally step into the light, just for a moment. I could almost hear her protesting, her voice hoarse from the cold and crying, trying to keep her kids with her. She wouldn't trust his people. She wouldn't trust anyone. Her fire, the thing that kept her alive this long, wouldn't be extinguished so easily. That fire was inspiring. I took a deep breath, my hand shaking as I reached for my phone. I wasn't just doing this for her anymore. I was doing it for me. For every time I locked my door and pretended I heard nothing. For every moment I chose fear over compassion. "My people," he probably told her. Well, we're supposed to be each other's people, aren't we? He wouldn't have fought her, I know it. He would have just picked up both those kids and carried them inside himself, daring her not to follow. That's the kind of power I saw in him. He didn't ask. He just did. And as I imagined him walking into that palace with a child in each arm, I finally found the courage to dial. I pressed the numbers for the Orlando Tenants Union, my throat tight. I would walk with him, he'd told her. A promise and a command. And in my own small, quiet way, I was finally going to walk with her too. As Chloe was probably stepping onto marble floors, blinded by the wealth and shame, my call connected. A tired voice answered on the other end. I didn't give my name. I just started talking. I told them about the illegal eviction at the apartment on South Halsted. I told them about the landlord, Mr. Henderson, and how he shut off her heat in the middle of winter and threw a mother and her two 5-year-old children out into a storm. I described the notice on her door, the fear in her eyes. It was a small, cowardly act, a whisper in the dark, but it was something. It was my apology, sent out into the cold night air. I remember that night like a wound that never healed. When the main doors opened, the woman who stumbled in was a ghost of the Signora Chloe I remembered. 5 years had stripped away her sparkle, replacing it with a hardness around the eyes and a body thickened by hardship, a fortress built of cheap food and constant fear. I saw her glance at Senor Victor, a man so dangerously perfect in his expensive suit, and I saw the shame crush her. I rushed forward before he even had to give the order, my arms already full of the warm towels I'd prepared the second I heard his car. Seeing her up close, seeing the exhaustion weighing down her wide shoulders, made me gasp. I crossed myself, a prayer for the soul I thought we had lost. Senora Chloe, I whispered, the name a rusty key in my throat, my own eyes betraying me with tears. Draw a bath, Rosa. Senor Victor's voice cut through my thoughts, a command as sharp as broken glass, though his eyes, they never left her. The hottest you can make it, he added, and bring the pediatric supplies. My heart leaped. I hadn't even processed the two small children he carried. I hurried to do his bidding. 10 minutes later, I saw Dr. Reed rush past me in the hall, his face grim. I lingered by the door, a servant's habit of being invisible but aware. I could see Senora Chloe perched on a velvet chair, a statue of misery, her thighs pressed together as if trying to disappear. She watched the doctor with the ferocity of a mother bear, a look I knew well. I prayed he would have good news. I pressed my ear to the heavy wood, catching Dr. Reed's hushed words. Mild hypothermia, slight malnutrition, a developing infection. Each word was a small dagger in my own heart. I could only imagine how they felt to Senor Victor. The doctor's final words, they were very, very close, seemed to suck all the air from the hallway. I felt the change even through the door, a drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the weather. His hands, I knew, would be clenched into fists. Get out, he said, and the quietness of it was more terrifying than any shout. I saw Dr. Reed exit, his relief palpable. I slipped in, gathered the used cloths and dressed the little ones in shirts that swam on them, my hands gentle. Then I too backed away, closing the doors on a silence that felt heavier than stone. From the hallway, the silence in that master suite was deafening. All I could hear was the faint, sleeping breaths of the children who had, until tonight, been a secret. I knew he was looking at her now, the way a wolf looks at its prey, or maybe its own wounded mate. Then his voice rumbled, low and terrifying, a sound that always meant someone's life was about to be ruined. The landlord, he said. Give me his name. I saw her through the crack in the door, pulling that towel around her like armor. She wouldn't look at him, and I understood why. Looking at him when he was like this was like staring into the sun. My own heart hammered against my ribs, a prayer forming on my lips for the man whose name was about to become a death sentence. She tried to deflect, her voice thin and watery. It doesn't matter, Victor. But it mattered. In our world, respect is everything, and this man had disrespected what was his. As he stepped closer, I could almost smell the expensive cologne from the hallway, a scent of power and cedar. He laid out her future like a king declaring a decree. You and my children will never leave this compound without a security detail. You will never know the feeling of cold or hunger again. It sounded like a promise, but I knew it was also a cage, a beautiful, gilded cage. But first, he insisted, his voice pure steel, you will give me the name of the man who put my blood on the street in a snowstorm. I held my breath, knowing she had no choice. I heard her finally break. her voice trembling as she named him. Paul Abernathy. She explained the whole miserable story, a day late with the rent, the cash right there in her pocket, and the insults. He called her a fat, lazy pig. I flinched, even from the hall. That single detail sealed the man's fate. The air in the house went still and cold, the way it always does before the Senor unleashes a storm. His voice, when he repeated the name Abernathy, was flat, empty, a judge's gavel falling for the last time. I watched him move closer until his fine leather shoes were touching her worn sneakers. "Stand up, Chloe," he commanded, and I knew she couldn't refuse. I felt a wave of pity for her, for him, for the man named Abernathy, who had no idea what was coming for him. Tears streamed down her face, the dam of 5 years of pain finally breaking. "Please, Victor, don't look at me. I'm disgusting," she pleaded, her words muffled by sobs. "I'm not the woman you remember." My own eyes welled up. I wanted to run in there, to shield her, to tell her she was a warrior, but my place was here, in the shadows, a silent witness. "Stand up." The command was softer this time, but held the weight of the world. I watched as she trembled, pushing her tired, heavy body out of that chair. She stood before him, trying to fold in on herself, a heartbreaking effort to hide the evidence of her struggle. Then he reached for the towel, and I had to look away, feeling I was intruding on something far too sacred for my eyes. I turned my head, but I heard the soft fall of the towel on the rug. I heard her small whimper of, "Victor, no," as he moved to take off her sweatshirt. I risked a glance back, just for a second. I saw him gently move her arms and pull the cheap, damp fabric over her head. She was left standing in a bra that was clearly old and too small, digging cruelly into her soft skin. Her stomach, a testament to the babies she carried and the hunger she endured, was round and marked with the silver lines of motherhood. I squeezed my eyes shut, expecting to hear his disgust. I waited for him to recoil from the reality of what the world had done to her, this woman he once treated like a treasure. But there was no disgust. Instead, I heard a sharp, hitching gasp from her. I opened my eyes, and my own breath caught in my throat. I saw his strong hands, hands that had ended men, gently cradling her waist. And then he dropped to his knees before her. Senor Victor Romano, the king of this dark city, a man who bowed to God and no one else, was kneeling on the Persian rug as if she were an altar. He pressed his face into the soft flesh of her stomach, holding her like a man drowning. The reverence was so profound it felt like a prayer. I finally understood. He didn't see what she saw. He saw a queen. He saw survival. I couldn't hear the words he whispered against her skin, but I saw the shiver that ran through her. He stood, his eyes blazing with a fire that could burn the world down. He held her face, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. Then his voice rose, filled with a cold, clear rage that echoed in the hall. "My father is rotting in hell," he declared, and the venom in his voice was shocking. "I would have put the bullet in his head myself." And then she broke completely, collapsing against his chest. He held all of her, his hard, disciplined frame a fortress around her soft, weary body, and for the first time, I saw that they truly fit. A king and his queen, forged in fire and grief. He held her, murmuring comforts I couldn't quite hear, his anger melting away into a tenderness reserved only for her. "Go to the bathroom," I heard him say, his voice thick with emotion as he kissed her hair. "Wash the street off you." He promised her his bed, his protection, a life where no one would ever hurt her again. But as she stepped away, a flicker of panic crossed her face. "Where are you going?" she asked. I saw it then. The mask of the kind lover fell away, replaced by the chillingly blank face of the businessman, the predator. It was the face I saw right before someone disappeared. He straightened his cuffs, the gesture calm and terrifyingly final. "I have some real estate to acquire," he said smoothly, the lie as well tailored as his suit. Sleep, Mia Bella. I knew exactly what kind of real estate he meant. I scurried away from the door and down the back stairs. The basement of this house was a place we staff knew to avoid. It wasn't for wine or storage. It was soundproofed for screams. I saw Declan Murphy and another man haul a shivering, rat-faced man in silk pajamas through a side door. We all turned away, polishing glasses that were already clean, dusting furniture that had no dust. We knew our job was not just to serve, but to be deaf, dumb, and blind to the brutal business of the Romano family. He changed his clothes, I know, into something dark, something for work. I didn't see him go down, but I felt it. The whole house felt it, a deep, humming dread that settled in the foundations. I was in the kitchen, preparing a warm broth for the children, when I heard it. Not a scream, but a sickening, wet crunch that even the concrete and steel below couldn't entirely swallow. It was a sound I had heard before. It was the sound of bones breaking. It was the sound of Senor Victor making a point that would never be forgotten. My hands trembled as I stirred the pot, praying for the souls of everyone in this violent, beautiful house. The man, Abernathy, would be screaming now, begging for a mercy that he would never receive. Senor Victor would be explaining in that terrifyingly calm voice exactly why his life was ending in a damp, bleach-scented room. He would talk about a fat, lazy pig and a cold night and two small children. The man would finally understand, and that understanding would be his final torment. Later, I crept back upstairs. I passed the master's suite and saw Senora Chloe was asleep in the center of that huge bed, looking small for the first time. On her nightstand, I placed a small silver milagro charm of a mother and child that my own mother had given me. A small, silent act of hope in a house that dealt in despair. I remember the look on his face when he dismissed Chloe as a nobody with no money. It was the same cruel dismissal I'd seen in Dominic's eyes for years. Victor's voice cut through the damp basement air, a lie that was truer than anything Abernathy understood. She is my wife. And just like that, the first domino fell. A cheap, arrogant landlord who'd locked children in the snow was about to pay for his sins, but I knew, watching from the shadows of the main floor, that he was just the appetizer for a much larger, more intimate betrayal. I'd been polishing the silver when Declan dragged the weeping landlord out, ruined and broken. I should have felt sick, but a dark part of me felt a grim satisfaction. For 5 years, I had watched this family suffer a quiet poison, and for 5 years, I had stayed silent. My cowardice was its own kind of crime. But last week, when I heard young Tommy was digging into the old servers, I finally did something. A single folded note slipped under his door in the dead of night, with just one name on it, Onyx Investigations. Victor walked past me, the faint scent of blood and cold rage clinging to him like a shroud. He looked right through me, his focus absolute. I saw him wipe a blade clean on a cloth before his private phone buzzed, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent mansion. He stepped into the hall to answer it, and I held my breath. That note was either my death sentence or this family's salvation. I watched him listen, his posture rigid, his knuckles white as he gripped the phone. This was it. The moment of truth. I saw the change in his eyes from across the hall. The fury directed at a stranger was gone, replaced by the hollowed-out look of profound betrayal. The old Don hadn't found her. Dominic had. My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew it. All those years ago, I'd seen Dominic's quiet satisfaction the day Chloe disappeared. I dismissed it as family politics, a thing beyond my station. I was wrong. It was pure evil, hiding behind a paternal smile and an expensive suit, and I had let it fester in this house. The phone in Victor's hand cracked under the pressure of his grip as he ended the call. He had brought his family home, only to find the real monster was already inside, waiting at his dinner table. I watched him walk up the grand staircase, and the Romano estate suddenly felt like a tomb. This wasn't just his fortress anymore. It was a cage with two predators inside. And I knew, with a sickening certainty, that only one of them would be walking out in the morning. The war had finally come home. The grandfather clock chimed 4 in the morning as I brought the cognac into the library. Outside, a blizzard was burying the world in white, but in here, the air was thick with lies. Dominic sat by the fire, a portrait of false peace in his velvet jacket, listening to Vivaldi, a silver-haired viper enjoying the warmth of a home he'd poisoned. He looked like a king, perfectly content with his power, unaware that the executioner was walking down the hall, and I, the humble servant, had just handed him the axe. When the heavy oak doors clicked shut, Dominic's eyes snapped open. The man was never truly at peace. I watched as Victor entered, his shirt still smelling faintly of another man's fear. He moved toward the bar cart where I stood, the silence between uncle and nephew stretching so tight I thought it might shatter the crystal. Dominic's voice, so smooth and paternal, was a lie I'd heard my whole life. "Victor, why are you handling street-level garbage?" I kept my head down, pretending to arrange the glasses, my presence completely ignored. I poured the Louis XIII as Victor spoke, his voice dangerously soft. The landlord evicted a woman and 2 children. He handed a glass to his uncle, the perfect picture of respect. I watched Dominic scoff, dismissing them as a tragedy of the lower classes. My hands tightened on the decanter. I remembered Chloe Henderson. I remembered her kindness, her laughter echoing in these halls. She was no tragedy. She was the best thing that ever happened to this house. Then Victor dropped the bomb, his voice an icy whisper. The woman was Chloe Henderson, and the children are my twins. I saw it. The tremor in Dominic's hand, so small anyone else would have missed it. A single drop of amber liquid stained his velvet jacket, a spot of guilt he couldn't hide. His feigned shock was a masterful performance, but I saw the flicker of pure panic in his eyes. "Praise the saints! You have heirs?" he boomed, the lie echoing off the mahogany walls. As Victor spoke of the old servers, I felt a cold dread mix with vindication. I wanted to see him burn for what he'd done, for the 5 years of grief he'd inflicted on the boy I helped raise. As Vivaldi scratched on the record player, Dominic's composure began to fray. "Your father was a paranoid man," he said, his voice carefully measured. But Victor wasn't buying the story anymore. He stepped closer, his presence looming over the older man. "My father didn't track her down," Victor said, and every word was a nail in Dominic's coffin. "The payment to Onyx Investigations came from an off-book account only you had the keys for, Uncle Dominic." The name from my note, now a weapon in Victor's hand. Dominic's mask of paternal concern shattered. "Victor, you are exhausted," he tried, but it was too late. "Do not insult my intelligence!" Victor's roar shook the room, and I flinched as he slammed his glass on the mantelpiece, the sound of shattering crystal like a gunshot. I saw 5 years of pain and fury unleashed in that one moment. Victor's words landed like blows, recounting the hunt, the forged order, the gun on the table. And I remembered Dominic's smugness while Victor was in Vegas, and the pieces of this sickening puzzle finally slammed together. The lie was dead. I watched, frozen, as the fear in Dominic's eyes was replaced by an ugly, arrogant sneer. The venom he'd hidden for so long finally spilled out. "She was a fat, pathetic liability," he spat. Before I could even process the words, Victor's hand shot out, and he hauled his uncle from the chair, slamming him against the fireplace. Dominic choked and clawed at Victor's arm, his face turning a dark, mottled purple. I stood by the bar cart, a silent, helpless witness to a lifetime of deceit meeting its violent end. "Why?" Victor's whisper was more terrifying than his roar, and then, gasping for air, Dominic confessed. "The safe, the penthouse safe, the Cayman Island ledgers. Of course, it was always about the money. I remembered Chloe asking me for folders to organize the paperwork in that safe. I remembered Dominic watching her, a strange, predatory stillness about him. She had seen the evidence of his skimming, and he panicked. He destroyed her life, threatened to kill her and her unborn children, all to cover his greed, And I saw it all, but understood none of it until now. I built this family, Dominic wheezed, a pathetic final lie. Victor's eyes went utterly dead. All the rage was gone, replaced by a terrifying calm. He dropped his uncle back into the chair like a bag of garbage. "You are a parasite," Victor said, his voice smooth as polished steel. "And in the Romano family, we amputate infected limbs." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver pillbox. As he dropped the single white capsule into Dominic's glass, I knew my small act of courage had just signed a man's death warrant. Justice in this house was finally being served. I remember the first time I suspected Dominic. He was watching the ledgers, thinking no one saw the greed in his eyes. I should have put a bullet in him then and saved everyone 5 years of hell. Instead, I stood outside the library door, hearing the faint strains of Vivaldi, my hand resting on my own Kimber. I heard his pathetic begging, offering up 30 million pieces of silver like a modern-day Judas. When Victor told him to drink or die, I tensed, ready to breach. But I knew Victor had it handled. This was justice, long overdue. This was family business, and I was the silent janitor waiting to clean up the mess, a role I had played for far too long. The silence that followed his plea was heavier than any gunshot. I could picture the whole scene, the poison, the terror in the old man's eyes, the cold emptiness in Victor's. He was a monster, but he was our monster, forged by betrayals just like this one. I didn't need to see Dominic's body shake or his hands claw at his chest. I'd seen what happens when you cross Victor Romano. It was a predictable, almost surgical outcome. The haunting music played on, a requiem for a traitor. When Victor finally holstered his weapon, I knew my part in this tragic play was about to begin. The cancer had been removed from the family, and it was my job to dispose of the tumor without leaving a scar. My phone buzzed. One word. Declan. His voice was unnaturally calm, the voice he used after a storm. I walked into the library, the smell of cognac and fear still hanging in the air. My uncle has suffered a tragic, fatal heart attack. The lie was perfect, clean. I nodded, already running the checklist in my head. Call Doc Reed, alert the capos, arrange the funeral. A funeral, and then a coronation. My stomach clenched with a feeling I hadn't allowed myself in years. Hope. The long night was finally over. The king was dead. Long live the king. As I made the calls, I thought of her, Chloe, and wondered if she knew the war fought in her name was finally won. I'd overseen the preparation of the master suite myself, making sure everything was perfect for her return. I remembered the day she left, a ghost slipping out into the city, and the 5 years of Victor's cold, simmering rage that followed. Seeing him now, sitting in that armchair, I could see the toll the night had taken. He'd killed his own blood and dismantled a lifetime of lies, all before sunrise. He looked like a king who'd just won a brutal war, exhausted but absolute in his victory. And then she appeared, a goddess wrapped in his shirt, her only thought for her children. I'd failed to protect her once. I swore on my life it would never happen again. I saw her bare feet hit the floor and the panic that erased everything but her maternal instinct. It was a primal, beautiful thing to witness. I had men searching for her and the kids for 5 solid years, turning over every slum and shelter in this city, and here they were, safe. I saw Rosa through the crack in the nursery door, giving Chloe that small, knowing smile. The wave of relief that hit her was so powerful, you could feel it across the room. She sagged against the doorframe, a warrior finally able to lay down her sword. They were safe. After all that time in the cold, they were finally home, and the world was about to be rearranged to keep them that way. When she turned back to face Victor, the entire dynamic in the room shifted. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet strength I hadn't seen in her since before she disappeared. "You didn't sleep," she said. And it wasn't an accusation, just a fact. "I had family business to attend to," he replied, and I knew he was talking about the body I had just sent to the crematorium. He handed her coffee, a simple gesture that felt like an offering, a promise. Strength. We would all need it for what was coming. This wasn't just a reunion. It was the dawn of a new, more ruthless empire, with her at its heart. I watched her start to explain, to apologize, but he cut her off. When he told her the truth about Dominic, I saw 5 years of misplaced fear and guilt crumble. I'll never forget the sight of her face as the realization hit her. The man who brought her pastries, the trusted uncle, was the rat who'd sent her into a living hell. Victor stepped into her space, his presence overwhelming, protective. He smelled of victory. Dominic drove you into the snow. It was a simple statement, but it was an absolution. It was the truth that would allow her to finally stop running and start ruling. Her mind was reeling. You could see it in her eyes. The entire nightmare, the hunger, the cold, the constant terror, all for greed. When she whispered, "Oh my God," it was the sound of a soul breaking and healing at the exact same time. The question she asked next, "What are you going to do?" hung in the air. I saw that flicker of vengeful fire in her eyes, the part of her that survived the streets and wanted justice. And Victor's reply was the coldest, most reassuring thing I'd ever heard. Nothing. He was a rat, and rats in our world simply disappear. He'd already handled it. He'd already burned the world down to keep her safe. He traced her jawline, and the final walls between them came crashing down. Uncle Dominic passed away. A heart attack. Tragic. The official story was set in stone. In that moment, Chloe understood everything. He didn't just love her. He would kill for her, erase history for her. It was a terrifying and intoxicating devotion. And then the king finally showed his own wounds. "I looked for you," he whispered, and the man who never broke, broke. He pulled her against him, and I quietly slipped from the room, leaving them to their reunion. My job was done for now. The queen was home. Their reunion was something sacred, something I had no right to witness, but I heard it all from the hall. The gut-wrenching confessions, the love that had survived an inferno. "I never hated you," she cried. "I had to protect the babies." He held her like she was the only thing anchoring him to this world. "You won the war, Mia Bella." He was right, she had. By keeping those children alive, she had saved the entire Romano bloodline and secured his legacy. The running is over. It was a promise to her, but a threat to everyone else. The game had changed, and the stakes were now higher than ever. "You are going to marry me." It wasn't a proposal, it was a decree, a coronation. He was going to put her on a throne and dare anyone to challenge her right to be there. I heard the promise of violence in his voice, the raw, possessive power that made men fear him. "I will take their eyes." And I knew he meant it literally. I would be the one handing him the tool to do it. From the hallway I saw her shiver but not pull back. She had walked through fire and survived. This new world, his world, held no fear for her anymore. She was ready. We all were. The age of the Romano queen was about to begin. 6 weeks later, standing in the Drake Hotel, the air was electric with fear and respect. I'd personally vetted every man on security, turning the hotel into a fortress worthy of a king and his queen. Downstairs, under the glittering chandeliers, the vultures had gathered. The Falcones, the Morettis, they were all here, pretending it was a christening. But we all knew it was a declaration of war and an affirmation of absolute power. Every capo in that room understood the message. Dominic's heart attack could happen to any of them. I watched them all, cataloging their faces, their whispers, their loyalties. My job was to see the threats before they materialized. The invitations were a formality. This gathering had one purpose: to show the world that Victor Romano was now the undisputed dictator of the national syndicate. His uncle's death was the bloody cornerstone of his new reign. And more than that, it was about her. The woman who had tamed the beast, the one who held his heart. They were all desperate and terrified to finally see her. I stood near the grand staircase, watching Victor hold court. He looked every bit the monarch, nursing that expensive bourbon as if he hadn't a care in the world. But I could see the tension in his shoulders, the constant scan of the room. He was a wolf, waiting for his mate to appear. As I managed the flow of tribute, my thoughts were upstairs with her. I'd seen the dress that was delivered, a creation of silk and diamonds fit for royalty. I thought about the woman I remembered from 5 years ago, soft, kind, and completely unaware of the world she'd married into. Then I thought of the woman who'd survived on the streets, protecting 2 children against impossible odds. The Paul Abernathys of the world had tried to break her, to make her feel small and ashamed. Tonight, they would see her reborn in fire. They would see the Queen Victor always knew she was, and they would fall to their knees. My small part in this was almost over. I just had to make sure they all bowed. I remember the first day I saw her. It feels like a lifetime ago, not just 5 years. She was a ghost, thin and shivering, clutching her children's hands so tightly her knuckles were white. Dominic, the uncle, had brought her here, and the way he looked at her made my skin crawl. I was new then, just a housemaid, and I learned quickly to be invisible. I saw the cruelty they showed her, the quiet starvation of dignity, and I said nothing. I was a coward. But tonight is different. Watching Rosa fuss over her, I can hardly breathe. The woman in the mirror is not a ghost. She's a large, formidable queen stepping into her power. That gown of blood-red velvet wasn't made to hide her size. It was crafted to celebrate it, a masterpiece of fabric and fury from some hidden shop on Oak Street. The dress announces her presence, lifting the heavy, magnificent swell of her breasts and sweeping over the lush, wide curves of her hips and thighs. It's a declaration of war on anyone who ever called her weak. She wears her body not as a burden, but as a fortress. Around her throat, the Romano diamonds glitter cold and sharp. I remember hearing they belonged to Victor's grandmother, locked away for decades. Seeing them on Chloe's skin feels like destiny. Their weight is a constant reminder of her new, unshakable reality, a reality I never fought for on her behalf. Her blonde hair is a crown of coils, her lips painted a defiant crimson. Rosa, her eyes wet with tears, smooths the gown's long train. "You are ready, Signora," she whispers, her voice thick with emotion. "You look like a goddess." I hold my breath, and Chloe's voice, once so fragile, answers with the strength of tempered steel. "I look like a mother who survived." She turns from her reflection, and in her eyes, I see every silent tear she shed in this house, every moment of fear I witnessed and ignored. The guilt is a stone in my gut. In the next room, the twins, Arthur and Lily, look like tiny royals in their formal clothes, their blue eyes wide with a child's curiosity as they hold their nanny's hands. I remember them hiding behind their mother's legs, terrified of every shadow. Chloe takes a final deep breath, the velvet bodice straining over her chest. It's time. Aura. I slip into the service corridor that overlooks the ballroom as the string quartet suddenly falls silent. The great mahogany doors at the top of the stairs swing open, and a heavy, waiting silence consumes the entire room. 300 of the city's most dangerous criminals, corrupt officials, and their wealthy companions all turn their faces upward as one. Every sound, every clink of glass, just stops. Then, Chloe steps into the light, and I feel a sob of pure triumph catch in my throat. A wave of complete, unspoken shock crashes through the Mafia's old guard. I can see it on their faces. They were expecting a whisper, a footnote. They wanted a thin, silent trophy wife to decorate Victor's arm, a frightened little bird they could easily crush. My silence helped them believe that lie. Instead, a powerhouse has arrived to burn their expectations to the ground. Chloe stands there, her magnificent, lush frame commanding the entire space. The blood-red velvet and the blinding diamonds make her seem like a warrior queen who has not just survived the fire, but learned to wield it. She doesn't flinch under their hundreds of stares. She holds her chin high, her broad shoulders back, radiating the primal protective power of a matriarch who has known real hunger. Victor doesn't wait for her at the bottom. He's already moving. He hands his drink to his second-in-command and starts climbing the stairs, his eyes locked on her. It's not just desire. It's a form of public worship so raw and ravenous, it feels like we are intruding on something sacred. I've seen this look in private, but seeing it on display for all these monsters is a strategic move, a warning. He reaches the landing, takes her trembling hand in his calloused one, and presses his lips to her knuckles. Then his cold blue eyes sweep across the crowd, a silent threat to anyone who would dare show her disrespect. Behind them, the nannies bring Arthur and Lily forward. A new sound rips through the ballroom, a gasp, a murmur, as every man sees the undeniable, piercing blue Romano eyes in that little boy's face, staring back at them. The last lie has been shattered. Victor's hand settles firmly on the small of Chloe's wide back, guiding her right to the edge of the landing, a silent statement that she stands with him, equal and adored. He looks down upon the empire he reclaimed. My friends, my family. His voice is a low baritone that fills the cavernous ballroom without effort, each word vibrating with absolute authority. For 5 long years, a shadow was cast over my house. It was placed there by traitors, cowards, and parasites who thought they could steal from this family and threaten what is mine. The words hang in the air like smoke. He's talking about Dominic. I remember Dominic's sneering face, his casual cruelty towards Chloe. The recent brutal purges of his men were not just rumors to the staff. We saw the aftermath. The shadow is gone. But tonight, that shadow is eradicated, Victor roars, his grip tightening on the heavy curve of Chloe's waist, anchoring her to his side. The old ways that allowed my family to be driven into the dark are dead. I present to you the future. My wife, Chloe Romano, the undisputed mother of the Orlando Syndicate, and my blood, Arthur and Lily Romano. He plucks a fresh glass of champagne from a waiter who has scrambled up the stairs. He raises the flute high, his gaze sweeping the room, cold as a winter storm. You will look at her, and you will know she is the queen of this city. Her word is my word. Her enemies are dead men walking. To the queen! For a moment, my own cowardice paralyzes me. But this is her justice. There is no hesitation. 300 men and women raise their glasses in a single, perfectly synchronized motion, a gesture born of terror and genuine awe. To the queen! The shout is an explosion, a shockwave that rattles the crystal chandeliers and echoes off the gold leaf ceilings. As thunderous applause follows and the highest-ranking capos begin to form a line to kiss her ring, I watch Chloe look up at the giant beside her. Victor is a monster, a ruthless killer who owns this city's soul. But the look he gives her is one of profound, violent, and absolute love. And in that moment, I see the last of the icy fear finally melt away from her. She didn't trade a park bench for a cage. I know now what I have to do. She found a throne, and the monster beside her is hers, completely. As the underworld bows, I slip away from my hiding spot. My silence has been my own cage, a prison of guilt and fear. But seeing her claim her power ignites something in me. I was a witness to her pain, and now I must be a witness to her justice. I know something no one else does. Dominic, in his arrogance, was careless. He thought of me as nothing more than furniture. I know where he hid his private ledger, the one detailing every bribe, every dirty deal, every traitor still hiding in the city's government. It's behind a loose brick in the back of the wine cellar. A final hidden piece of the shadow, and I'm going to bring it into the light. There is a moment in this story that most people will miss because they are too focused on the violence, the power, and the diamonds. It is not the moment Victor Romano drops to his knees before a woman the world had decided was worthless. It is not the moment 300 of the city's most dangerous men raise their glasses to a queen they never saw coming. It is a quieter moment than that. It is a neighbor, standing behind faded curtains, finally picking up a phone. It is a housekeeper, folding a single piece of paper in the dead of night and sliding it under a door. It is two ordinary, frightened people deciding that their silence had already cost too much. That is the real story. And the lesson it carries is one of the most uncomfortable truths a human being can face. Silence is never neutral, it is always a choice, and it always has a price. For 5 years, people watched Chloe struggle. They heard the landlord's cruelty through paper-thin walls. They saw the exhaustion on her face, the patched coat, the second-hand toys. They felt the wrongness of it settle in their chests every single day. And every single day, they chose the easier thing. They looked away. They told themselves it was not their fight. They told themselves staying quiet kept them safe. But safety purchased with someone else's suffering is not peace. It is debt. And debts always come due. Here is what this story teaches us about power. Real power. Not the kind that comes from money or fear, but the kind that lasts. Real power is never built on silence. It is built on the willingness to act when acting costs you something. The neighbor who made that call did not have a weapon. She did not have wealth or connections, or the name Romano behind her. She had nothing but a shaking hand and a phone, and the decision that she could no longer live with the sound of her own cowardice. That decision changed everything. And then there is Chloe herself, a woman who carried 2 children through 5 years of hunger, cold, and fear, not because she was unbreakable, but because she refused to let her breaking destroy them. Her body, her exhaustion, her survival, these were not signs of weakness. They were the architecture of a mother's love made visible. She did not need saving. She needed the world to stop punishing her for surviving in it. Victor Romano is a monster. This story does not pretend otherwise. But even monsters understand one law that the respectable world conveniently forgets. You do not get to harm what belongs to someone and walk away clean. Every action has an accounting. Every cruelty leaves a ledger entry. The only question is who holds the pen when the bill finally arrives. So ask yourself honestly, in your own life, in your own silence, whose story are you standing behind faded curtains watching? And what is that silence actually costing them? Because the phone is always right there. The note can always be folded. The brick in the wall always has something hidden behind it. The only question is whether you are brave enough to reach for it. All elements within this narrative are fictional and crafted for storytelling purposes. The author bears no intention of referencing real people, cultures, or events in a literal sense. Readers are encouraged to engage with the work as a piece of creative expression rather than documented reality.